Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Casual Cafe. Tonight we have a very special episode teaching you how to go from apathy in everyday life and not knowing what to think about these events that you see going on and transitioning into activism. With me on the Skype is James Pilato in Oregon and Jan Powers in Texas. Gentlemen, how are you doing this evening?
Doing great.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, this conversation was inspired by Jan, who would probably credit James and I in some fashion, but he sent a tweet and wanted to know if we would do a discussion on how to podcast, which is basically a first step to making films and all sorts of other activism. It's about how to lay out your thoughts in a coherent fashion, recording them in such a way that it's pleasant to the ear for someone else to listen, and posting them in such a way that other people can find it. So, Jan, what would be your first question on the topics you wanted to discuss tonight?
Basically get the basics out of the way. Mostly, what kind of microphone and camera do you suggest using in the very start of your podcast?
All right, and for the answer to that, I'm going to yield to my patriot friend, James Pilato, who has much experience in his... How many hundreds of episodes have you done of the New World Next Week with James Corbett, another affiliate of ours? What do you think, James? Have you enough experience in talking into a microphone and speaking into a camera to address this issue?
I think I can at least address the audio part of it, because I would have to completely defer and thank James Corbett because he does all the video work on his end. I basically have to show up with stories and essentially he does the most of it. I think as far as the microphone, I'm lucky in that this condenser microphone, which I think is going to give your best quality. It's even the kind of thing that, when I'll Skype with my parents, they'll stop at some point and go, gosh, your microphone sounds great. So it will work for, professional work and also just to, talk with friends and family. An old program director at a radio station I worked at back east, actually, I think he was probably just using up some station funds that he had at his disposal and bought, I think, several of these microphones off Amazon. I think it was on a cheap deal. And these are, I've never heard of the name, MXL 990. And I think it's probably just kind of a knockoff model. I bet if you go to Amazon, you'll find still a slew of them in there. I think always under $100. It's been a great investment. I've had it for... probably going on 10 years. There was probably a long time where I didn't use it, but once I got seriously into doing podcasting, not only with Media Monarchy, but then especially with New World Next Week, it's become a really indispensable tool.
That was a good answer. So for my end of it, I'm going to start out with how I started out. I used a $60 Samson is the brand USB microphone. It was a CO1 USB if you're looking it up on the Google. You can probably get them pretty cheap now. It's an interesting microphone because it's a condenser mic that's powered through the USB cord, plugs into basically any MacBook or any other PC type computer, and it gives you decent sound. Once I learned more about sound and had more listeners and had more money to invest in a microphone, I only bought one after somebody donated this nice Electro Voice RE20, which is a standard grade, professional quality broadcast microphone. In fact, Rush Limbaugh uses the same microphone, only his is gold plated. And then after I heard the quality of this, I bought one. So when Lisa's on the podcast, we have a matching mic up here, because otherwise you can't use the $60 mic with the $300 mic. The sound quality is just compromised. So that's one of the answers on sound. That's how I do it for podcast. I do it differently for the studio downstairs. I use lavalier mics wired in the studio, and you can also get wireless ones. I recommend Sennheiser. The G3 series is good, and I use that when I need a wireless lav mic when we're out in the field filming. And as far as a camera, I use a 910 Logitech webcam, which gives you pretty decent HD. It's kind of pricey, but they also just came out with some Logitechs that are like $40. I think a C310 is also a 720p HD signal. It's affordable. It gives you a crisp, clean visual. And what I actually filmed this show and the show downstairs on are Canon DSLR cameras that take like a 32 gigabyte SD or a CF card goes in 7D. And these cameras are affordable. You can get used FD mount lenses on eBay from the 80s. So you can get a nice, crisp 50 millimeter look that will look cinematic for under $100 that you add on to a camera that you can buy on Craigslist for like $300. And so for less than a smartphone these days, you can actually get some cinematic grade pictures going on. And if you light it properly, this is not lit properly, but it is lit a little bit, and get good sound, then people will watch if you say interesting things.
I would also add too, I think with this condenser mic, it's running through an XLR audio cable and needs actual, phantom power on this mixer that I'm using. So I guess you would have.
Right, so let's address that, because that's got to be one of his next questions. The difference between the Samson USB microphone that you can get for $60 and what I would refer to as a real microphone is you're using XLR connections, which means you need to plug it into something that you can moderate the volume and the gain and all these other pieces of grammar that once you learn the terms and understand how it all works, it makes a lot more sense. But then you'll need to take the mixer and connect it into your computer. So there are some technical steps once you want to step it up, but the simplicity is you can get started. You can get started even without an external microphone. I mean, everyone has a computer these days and a smartphone that is able to record in high definition and get sound and connect to the internet instantaneously. Back when I learned, there was nothing much on the internet to connect to except maybe Google Video. After I learned for a year or two, it's like, oh, there's actually a place besides a specialty camera place on the web. Exposure Room is what I first used, that would allow you to upload footage and share it and embed it and do cool stuff like that. So you're actually in this prime age that, James and I were there when the Skype didn't work so well and we used other stuff. And, there's a long bad tech history of how we got here. But focusing on, like, if you were starting a podcast today, you have all these tools at your disposal. You have all this open source stuff. You have all this Apple stuff that's built in. And all you have to do is take a couple of days, couple hours, learn how to use it. And it's going to change your life because it's a whole different form of expression. This is what John Taylor Gatto would refer to as the active literacies, being able to not only observe, identify, organize, remove those contradictions, but also to take action and communicate. So, podcasting is just one small step in the right direction, but it's a meaningful step that'll change your life.
Anything else you want to ask about maybe audio or video?
Definitely. Actually, one question that came up while I was listening to you guys. What program would you suggest using for Windows-based users and then Mac users, or if there's a program for everyone that we should be using to record your audio files and that type of deal?
Go ahead, James.
Oh, I have used something ever since it was called Cool Edit Pro in essentially the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then Adobe bought it and they've called it Audition ever since. And I use it to this day. And it's always been for me just such a great program that you can do really simple things pretty quickly, and it has a whole set of, you can automate things that you maybe repeat functions, but it also will let you get really, really complicated, much more complicated than I've ever probably pushed it to its limitations. But I've always found Adobe Audition to be a really great tool. On the flip side, I would say you can also just use something open source, something like Audacity, if you just need to kind of cut and paste and do something simple, just kind of to get going.
I laugh because I don't know anyone else that uses Cool Edit except Jan Irvin, because he gave it to me, and it was like, he's like, they don't make this anymore, but it's the best thing to edit audio with. And ever since then, I've had like some version. It's like 15 years old, and you have to be very sensitive with it, otherwise it won't work right. And it does have some quirks to it. And all my friends are like using Pro Tools, and they spend thousands of dollars and get all this stuff, or they're using GarageBand that came with their Mac and it has all this built-in stuff, or they're using Audacity, and I didn't feel at home with Audacity after I'd experienced Cool Edit / what they call it now is Adobe Audition. And I'm pretty sure they give it away for free now, so it's all legal because Adobe gave CS2 away, and I think Audition's part of that. So we both use, and as far as, I don't know, Corbett uses some Apple program, I'm sure, but those of us who are using PCs, we're using Cool Edit / Adobe Audition. And James, that's working for you too, right?
Absolutely. I use it on my Mac setups here at home.
Platform, then.
And actually, I can tell you now, I mean, ever since last fall, I've my actual day job is working at a commercial radio station, and they all use Audition. So I got there, and it was a nice, simple thing. I was kind of expecting there'd be other programs I may have to use because that's what they use, but no, for doing the kind of behind the scenes, audio production that I do, yeah, again, it's Adobe Audition.
I'm so glad to know that. I feel all grown up now. All right, Jan, does that answer that question?
Definitely. Definitely gives a wide range of resources for us to use in the future, for myself to go ahead and explore offline here. Now, once I get the audio actually recorded and I have all my mics and video cameras all taken care of, what kind of server space should I look into getting?
Rich?
All right, the server space story. When I first started my podcast in 2006, 9/11 Synchronicity was my first podcast, and I contracted through a service called Liberated Syndication, or Libsyn. And that's because the only other podcast I'd ever heard at that point probably came off of that same place. So I was like, they host it, so it's cool. And so I started paying whatever, $20 a month, whatever their plan was back then. And it's cool because it's a limited upload but unlimited bandwidth. So you just have to be careful, the size of your files, how much you're publishing, and and it's pretty reasonable. And I've never had a problem with them. I think they've been bought out, or some venture capital company bought them, or whatever that story is. But the services stayed consistent, so that's a safe bet. However, the user interface kind of sucks, and it really hasn't improved over the past 7 years. And so I use them as the Tragedy and Hope Peace Revolution podcast archive stream. So on that stream, which is the only one I found out that showed up in iTunes, we can talk about that in a couple minutes. But I was just fixing that yesterday. So that's the one that shows up in iTunes. I use another service for Peace Revolution because when I started that podcast, I wanted more user interface features than what Liberated Syndication was, doing. So I got with this company called Podomatic. They're the largest company that's doing podcasts. They got like 15,000 podcasts being hosted on there, and they've got good service too and good user interface, and that's all good. It's a little bit more expensive, and they limit your upload space and your bandwidth. The upload space, I never have a problem with. I don't go over their upload space. I do with Libsyn sometimes, but I publish 10-hour podcasts. So I'm breaking everybody's system, including Adobe sometimes doesn't want to render if, something over a certain amount of time, but you'll never get near that. So the thing with Podomatic is that sometimes if you release a popular episode and it spreads to a bunch of people and then they want to download all the episodes at once, it's going to eat up your bandwidth, and then people get, sorry, this podcast is too popular, which is kind of a good thing. That means people got to get there, and it's limited downloads for the month or whatever. And you can always upgrade, but that costs more money. So you have to balance how much are you willing to spend on server time. Now, Corbett, I'm pretty sure, pays for his own server or has a server space donated to him. It's on his own site, so he's not actually using a hosting service per se. He's listing it on his website in such a way that iTunes can call out to it, or it's using the RSS feed or something like that. We might have to do another episode just to interview Corbett to learn all his tricks of the trade and his secrets, because I got a couple questions I'd like to ask. But that's kind of the ins and outs of server space. Now, I'm interested to hear how James does it. He's always hosted it on Media Monarchy, but that's a WordPress blog spot. I don't know how that all works. So, James, tell us how that all works at Media Monarchy and pump up the volume.
I think I always did it. I think I was always just trying to do it cheaply, I guess. I think I'm just always kind of naturally thrifty. So when I started Media Monarchy, I was just looking at how can I do this and actually really not spend a dime. So I've always pretty much had all my blogs on Google's Blogger. And again, there's, even as we look at the news today, we see all of these things can be fraught with various levels of, wait, why do I want to participate in that? But that's for a different episode. I've always used Google's Blogger or Blogspot because, it ties in with all of their things. And, it just always kind of worked really well. And as far as you're asking actually about server space, not so much, where I type up blogs, but the way I do it, they actually work together. I always used two things, and one has kind of fallen by the wayside, and I haven't really uploaded to there recently. But essentially, I was always looking for free hosting, and one was a place called Radio for all.net. And it's pretty much just podcasts of, activist regional things, a lot of UK activism and things on there. So I always liked it because I was instantly in an area of people who were going to be receptive to it. And it had, an RSS feed, but it wasn't really, you couldn't customize it very much. So I also started to use what is, the Internet Archive, archive.org, which a lot of folks may know is the place that has the Prelinger archives where you can go and watch all the tons of publicly available, public domain, all those videos and audio bits. You can upload to there, and again, I've always in Media Monarchy, because it's part and parcel of it, I've always used lots of clips, lots of songs, and I've just kind of done it brazenly, I suppose, and I've never actually I've never run into any problem of any of the music I use. I think generally because I tend to veer more on the independent side, and I'm always promoting them too, because if I'm playing a band, I'm actually excited and talking about them, and I'll give the links and all that kind of stuff. But archive.org is the place where I upload MP3s. It's where I do, especially with New World Next Week, there's a lot of redundancy built in. The New World Next Week episodes are stored on a multitude of platforms in a multitude of formats, which again, it helps, the ease of, I want every person, no matter what kind of device they may be using, to be able to either watch or listen to whatever you do. So New World Next Week is actually on Blip, and it's on James's own servers, but I also upload it myself to archive.org. One of the great things I've always liked about archive.org is also it will generate derivative file formats. So, for example, when I upload an FLV, a Flash video, a .FLV file, it will convert it into also a .ogv, which is kind of an open source video format. And it will generate these other kind of high and lower quality formats, which again is just great to kind of serve out to everyone. Once I've uploaded my podcast, New World Next Week, or the main one I've been doing lately, as Rich, you just mentioned, I appreciate that, Pump Up the Volume. I've been doing a weekly new music podcast myself that I pre-record and actually build in Adobe Audition. I use the multi-tracker, so that's actually how I can kind of make great sounding mixes that flow really well.
Can we talk about the multi-track? Oh, I heard an echo.
Well, I was just gonna. I can finish my not server space.
Oh, go ahead.
So, once I upload my stuff to archive, I can then look at that link, look at where it lives. Right click on it, and save link location, and then I paste that in on my blog post. So on blogs, you'll find, I think now what are kind of called media enclosures, or essentially, when I publish this, the internet should look for dynamic content. Oh, is there an MP3 in here? Is there a video? Is there something that I can serve out via an RSS feed, which we'll also talk about. So again, for me, it's always been simple and free to just upload it to archive.org and have my podcast, point to that. So that's ultimately where it lives. If that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense more often than not, using like different resources that are already out there to host. For some folks who aren't able to be, put any money into what they're doing right away. I guess we could transition into my next question. It'd be more so, how do you go about booking guests? What exactly do you guys do to go ahead and get the people that you'd like to interview on your show?
I would say, the same way you connect up with people that you like or people that you find interesting. I know we've mentioned Corbett and Rich. I think in the very beginning, I emailed people whose work struck me and resonated with me, who seemed, just real. And I think I probably emailed you, Rich, and I first emailed James Corbett, both back in 2006. Initially just to say, hey, I really like your work, keep it up. And then the conversation naturally evolved from there. But I think as far as I find booking guests, and now especially trying to do it for Ground Zero Radio, again, my day job, I've found if I'm really open-ended with people, and again, it depends on how busy, the person you're looking for may or may not be. I found you want to be open and sort of say, hey, I want you to come on the show anytime you want. It's almost less likely. I find it's more, I find more success if I say, hey, I'd love to have you on the show. Could you come on at A, B, or C? And you kind of already narrow down the choices. And I think that lets someone make a more actionable decision and go, C, yeah, I'll do that. And then you can kind of start rolling from there. But yeah, I think I never really, for myself, as far as Media Monarchy went, I never had a ton of guests regularly scheduled. I think I would have folks as they maybe floated into the sphere, which again, here in Portland, Oregon, you meet lots of interesting folks that kind of come and travel through and you didn't realize actually lived here. But I've definitely been booking more guests on Ground Zero than I ever did for Media Monarchy. So again, I think it's just to sort of, I end up having a pretty much almost like a form letter, so to speak, that essentially has the request, the interview request, and I pretty much just X out. I literally have X's for the parts where I fill it in. So I have basically a form letter that says, hey, X, I'm James from, Media Monarchy or Ground Zero or whichever spot I may be representing. We'd love to have you on the show X to discuss X. And it's a fast way for me to actually, send that out. And then at the bottom, it's got, my contact, my title, the phone, email, or any of that kind of stuff, whichever things you do or don't want to offer as your contact information. But I think it's always just kind of be forthright with people and let them know what you hope to kind of get out of it. I'd like to talk to you about X, and, a half hour would be great. If you give me an hour, that'd be even better. I think to give them as much information that they can go, yes, I want to do that. Rich?
I think what you're asking is that there's two types of situations. There's a situation where you're planning out an episode and you think, wow, this person's work who I'm already familiar with will be really great, and I want to contact them. And then you do as James said. I mean, there's a variety of different email formats. There's not a correct one, but they all involve succinctly communicating what you want and what's the quid pro quo. If you do an interview with me, it'll be done professional quality. Lots of people will hear it. You'll be treated fairly. It'll be an objective conversation. It's not going to be, ad hominem attacks and emotional. It'll be, respecting and showcasing your work and giving you a platform to speak freely. That's kind of how I do it. That's how James does it. That's how James Corbett does it. That's how Jan Irvin does it. So those are the two, that's one of the types. The second part is you were just out researching the NSA whistleblower case or the IRS case or whatever, and you find, hey, here's somebody who has some information. I want to interview them. You might contact them through Twitter. You might look up their website and go through the contact form. You might try multiple ways of getting in touch with them, but not too aggressive, just letting them know that it's important to you. And if it's important to them, maybe you guys can have a conversation. And I think you maybe in that case would communicate before you're fully aware of their work. So while that communication's out there and you're waiting for the response, you're continuing to go through and ask the 5 W's plus how and vet them and see if there's any contradictions. And you're also coming up with great interview questions. So if there is a follow-up email exchange, you have a couple things of substance that you can translate back. So those are basically the two obvious types of interview. You also get the person who walks into your living room and says, hey, I got a lot to say. You got a camera. Let's talk. Those are good interviews too. So, it's about going with the flow, reading the situation, but always being polite and courteous, using nonviolent communication. Nobody should do or has to do anything. You're just making a humble, exchange of information, and you're offering a service if you're doing an interview. And there's an interesting story behind the interview, but that's a different conversation, where it came from, who invented it, why it's popular today. The bottom line is you need to set up a sound environment where you and the person you're talking to can be captured clearly on audio, if that's what you're doing as a podcast. You need to have an outline and a structure and a purpose, an ingress, a purpose, and an egress. in, processing, and output. Those are the basic components when you're trying to structure how do you invite somebody for an interview, why should they take time out of their schedule to do an interview with you, what backlash could happen if they do an interview on a poorly produced show or one that's not edited, or these sort of things. So it's all about really just being a human being, knowing how to communicate with other human beings in a compassionate, friendly way. Not everyone's going to respond. Some people don't get the email. Some people have too many things to do. Some people are focused on something else. And even though they would be interested, you didn't ask at the right time. And sometimes 6 months later, if I haven't heard from somebody, I'll send them another email or, something like that. But there's too much to learn out in the world to go crazy after trying to get one person for an interview. So I think, just keep it light, have a purpose, don't waste people's time. And you're going to win some and lose some, but you'll win more than you lose.
I think it's interesting to know too that in this day and age, with the amount of ways that we can contact one another, it can almost make it that much more difficult, that much more labyrinthine. And I find myself with my regular contacts finding myself remembering, oh, that's right, I generally talk with Ron through the Facebook chat. Oh, this other person, they're more email. So I think as far as trying to maybe contact someone, to get them to for an interview, to maybe come on the show or whatever the stage may be, is looking for where they're most active. So I know when I'm trying to kind of track someone down, so to speak, find that place that they seem to be most active, whether it is their own blog or website, or if it's on Twitter, or if it's on Facebook, find that, that square that they're most active, and then go engage them there. And I find you'll be more, be more likely. But then on the flip side, Rich, I'm sure all of us could probably say there's a ton of people that it's like, the bigger fish. It's like, yeah, I've tried, I've done this and this and this and this. Damn if I've ever had any contact with Webster Tarpley, or someone who's, I've tried multiple levels through multiple years, but it's just never really happened. Why that is, not really sure. And yeah, there's a whole other probably list of people, but you kind of keep moving along. And again, I would note when I've had folks on the show in the past, it was usually probably a specific thing. So when you do contact that person, make sure to say, I had the pleasure of interviewing Reverend Billy, who's sort of a street preacher protest. And he came on the show, but I wanted to have him on to say, I want to specifically talk about how JP Morgan Chase has been funding mountaintop removal mining in West Virginia. So I was very like, this is why I want to have you on. Now we can hopefully, chat and talk about all kinds of other stuff, but that's the main thing, that I want to get across.
Well, and before you ask another question, Jan, from the interviewee side, I'll let you know that some places will book you and they don't give you an outline. They don't give you a topic. It's, it's a spinning roulette wheel of whatever they feel like talking about that day, and you're going to be on there. And that's all good, because the hard part of the interview, in my opinion, is the person asking the questions. All I have to do is answer. I either know or don't know. Not a big deal. There are other interviews, like I did a We Are Change Connecticut interview here last week. I got contacted through Twitter, and I was like, hey, can you send me an email? And it was like, okay, but you'll have to wait till later, because that person uses Twitter all the time. And I was like, wow, in order to communicate where he's at in his square, as James said, you basically have to use 140 characters, for those of you who don't know how to use TweetDeck or Twitter or whatever. And I was like, I'm communicating these little sound bites, trying to make arrangements and production questions and these sort of things that I wanted to know. Where did you want to film it? How long? What's the topic? So and then there's other interviews that I've gone after, like John Taylor Gatto. I think we wrote to him a year or two before we actually interviewed him, and the letter didn't get to him, and you send the package with the DVD or whatever, and it doesn't get there, and so one of your friends interviews him, but then he goes back off the radar. So it was really through trial and error. It's through persistence. I mean, what I say at the beginning of the Ultimate History Lessons, no joke. It's persistence, really, despite the resistance, that makes success.
That sounds great. Actually, it's kind of what I thought it would be like, mostly. Just be as detailed as you possibly can be and don't waste anybody's time. Time's pretty much the most important resource that we have. But let's say I do go ahead and get an interview set up and I want to go ahead and conduct it over Skype. Now, how do you obtain the audio and or video files from a session of conversation?
That is an excellent question, one that I still battle with from time to time. And I also might add, your first interview is going pretty well. You contacted us, we set a time. You see how this is going. Like, you've asked these questions, but in the asking of the questions, you've already gone through those first steps of actually getting this done. And if I share with you my Skype recording of this conversation and do a little production, you'll have a fantastic first episode that I think will be really useful to other people who want to know these answers and don't want to go through all the 7 years of trial and error that James and I have gone through so far. Now, to address the question of what was your question?
Well, I think I can take it, because I think maybe I can talk about sort of the easier end, because I think, Rich, what you're doing right now on your end is the more advanced end. So for me, there's something. I guess it's officially sanctioned by Skype. It's essentially called Call Recorder, and it's by a company called Ecamm, ECAMM. And I believe it's $10, and it's one of those kind of easy purchases where you go, you do it once. It's never really been a problem. It always updates and upgrades. They never try and upsell me on a bunch of other junk. But it's called Call Recorder, and once you install it, it is a part of then your Skype preferences or your control panel or whatever it may be called, which Mac or PC platform you're using. So once you install Call Recorder, it's a new option in your Skype preferences that gives you some settings of what you want to record. So it can even say, I just want to record the audio of this conversation, and it'll do that. And you can say that I want you to, every time I connect on a call, I want you to automatically start recording. You can have that, so you'll always have your calls recorded. I don't actually use that. You'll find you end up filling up your hard drive with recordings of calls you didn't actually intend to record. But it gives you the choices of split screen, and so it will show the two people having the video conversation split screen. You can record just your end, your local end. I could record just you on the remote. You're on the remote end. Or you can also, I think, record both of those. The more you try and ask it to do, and again, these are the problems I've been kind of running into myself. I might be reaching the limits and might have to invest in some hardware upgrades. But the more you ask it to do, the more its brain is trying to process. So again, I find on my end, I don't have the video ability to record both my end and both your end. Again, that's what's nice about doing New World Next Week with James, is he, on his end, uses Call Recorder to capture the video I am sending him while we do the episode. And then, Rich, I think this will be the handoff to you. James is essentially videotaping himself on a different standalone camera that he then captures that footage into his audio editor.
It's always pleasing to learn the secrets behind the Corbett Report production. The details you pick up from working with him every week. I just want to, get some of those juicy details. All right, so James does something similar to what I do, because I always saw his computer's behind him, so he's obviously got a camera in front of him. Excellent job that he's done breaking. He's like a pathfinder, a trailblazer, going into the unknown. He had the advantage of being a Mac user. It is easier to use Call Recorder on a Mac. Lisa has a Mac here on the desk. She uses Call Recorder when we have to do stuff like that. We don't use the Mac for a lot of production, but it is very consistent. I've really never seen it crash or lose a call or any of the other things that were going to be part of the story I'm going to tell you right now. I've used a long series of different Skype recorders trying to get production quality audio. And then when you try to capture video, it's a whole other game. So I'll just tell you what I found recently that I've been using, and it's what you see in my productions. So if you think that's high quality, then cool. It's called ZD Soft Screen Recorder. It's like $40. You can use it for free and test it out to make sure it works in all your needs, which is what I did, because I had already gotten burned buying a couple things that I thought, oh, this will work, it'll have to work. I tested it up here, it worked fine, tested it down in studio, it crashed and lost calls and all the other pains that you want to avoid by watching this video. So I won't name the rest that don't work. You know, the one that works, ZD Soft Recorder is what it's called. That's what I'm using right now to capture the other two Skypes incoming. However, I don't think it records my Skype. So my camera would be a problem, which is why I use this other production camera in front and not trying to capture my webcam. If I didn't have that advantage, I would have someone else, like James Pilato, capture my video feed from this webcam right here. I would cut those two together. And once you learn how to cut multi-tracks of audio, taking the next step to cut multi-tracks of video, multi-camera angles is a very simple step. So all of these little steps that you have to learn to do your first podcast are actually steps that lead toward gaining experiences and talents and capabilities and skill sets that even if you lost all this stuff, you would still have that. That's still valuable. You can make yourself valuable to some other human being that has resources, and you can survive because you've built these new talent skill sets that no one else, has seemed to take time to master these days. So, ZD Soft, I think, is kind of idiot proof. It's instead of a bunch of different click through menus, it's basically got pictures. What do you want to record? What audio sources do you want to take it from? Where do you want to save it? These sort of things, so that you never record or think you have a recording that's in a different setting or different codec, or these different problems that crop up when you try to actually get stuff done. And so after many trials and tribulations, I didn't go with a Skype recorder for PC because I found them unreliable. What I fell back to was just capturing the screen. And then if you show anything else during your conversation, it's going to capture what you looked up on the web or the Wikipedia page you're reading from or whatever during your podcast, because you want to do something interesting and meaningful to other people. So it's going to have substance in it. So if you want to have that show through in your production, you have to plan for it in pre-production.
Something you will find, and again, I've been running into this a little more recently, and it's you have to start to kind of troubleshoot and figure out maybe where the problem is. Again, if you try and maybe push your computer or push Skype to beyond its limits, it'll give you a message basically saying, I can't send this image fast enough and record it at the same time. It'll sort of say, I'm not going to do this for you. I can let you have your video conversation, but I can't also record it at the same, so I wonder if, sometimes that's just an internet problem on my end. So there's a multitude of things that may or may not pop up at the time of the day that you do it. And whether or not ultimately you want to do audio or video. So I know for myself, I've always been a radio guy. So then I've been lucky to be able to work with guys like Rich or guys like James Corbett, who can do a little bit more of the video work on their end, I guess.
Next question.
Sure. Are there any other programs to use to enhance the audio of your podcast? I hear there's this program called the Levelator. I'm just not familiar with it. I wonder if you guys had used that.
I'll take that because the reason it's on his list is because I said, make sure you ask us about the Levelator. Let me think how to do it. If you have more than one track of audio, and this is where it goes from you've just been hearing music all your life, and now you're trying to actually put tracks together to a podcast. It's still spoken word. You might want to layer some music behind it, and now you're discovering the composition of what you've heard out there as music are a bunch of different layers of different instruments and vocals all put together, and that's called a multi-track screen. So you can bring in, I'll actually show this in the end production. You can bring in some raw audio from, say, this conversation. You can put some music under it. You can mix some other music under it and make some complex beats out of simple little files. And what you're going to get is a lot more rich. And so this is multi-track editing. When you have that, and especially if you play clips, let's say James is doing a podcast, he's telling you the news, now he's going to go to the news clip, and then he's going back to him talking. What you are left with is trying to match volumes by ear, and it's kind of hard to do. And the waveforms are deceiving because just because a waveform has height doesn't mean it's louder. It's actually the density, it's calculus, it's the space under those curves that make loudness occur. So these are all things you learn when you try to figure out why does my podcast not sound cool. So when you go through all this trouble to try to get all this volumes from the different tracks at the same level, it's hit or miss sometimes. And you can, kind of feel it when you're listening, or you can look at it. There's a couple different things you can do, but they're kind of all hit or miss. While these really smart, geeky guys came together and said, hey, we're all running into the same problem. Let's create a piece of open source software and just put it out there. And basically, you produce your end result podcast as a mix down, which you'll probably want to do in a WAV file first. You drop it on this tool called Levelator. So you download it for free, you install it, you open it, you drag and drop a file onto it. As long as it's a WAV file or a bunch of WAV files, it'll go through and use all these heavy-duty mathematical analytics, which they list on their website. It's very impressive. And what it does is the end result is it's very pleasing to the ear because your listener is not left jumping for the volume every time you change tracks or something different goes on. Case in point would be the Joe Rogan Experience, very popular podcast, in dire need of the Levelator, because as a listener, sometimes you're in a road trip or you're in the car, or you're in a smart device or whatever, you're left trying to go from what you're doing back to hit the volume because you can't hear David Lee Roth or whoever's talking, right? So there's a disparity in two mics at the same desk. Just think when you're trying to put a whole bunch of different clips together. So that one piece of free software has greatly improved the production value of not only the Peace Revolution podcast, but I shared it with everyone that I know, and I know a lot of podcasters. So, I think there's more than one person using it now and improving their show, just because when we found useful information, we took the time and care to share it with each other instead of treating it as a competitive advantage. Because it doesn't do me any good to sound clear if my compatriots, my colleagues, the people who are trying to do the same thing from a different angle can't be just as clear. So I like to share information when I get it like that.
Yeah, I haven't actually. I know I saw it in our pre-production, but yeah, no, I've never actually used that. I should probably look into that because that's still something to this day I always kind of run into, of battling between. And especially the more clips you use, especially if they span different years. And again, I do work using a lot of music. Different eras of music are wildly different, sound quality. So I might well benefit from something like the Levelator. I would add, I think, a way that I've been doing it myself, maybe pre-Levelator, is finding settings that you like, that you think work, and just kind of make sure that if it's your own workspace, that your levels and maybe your settings or how much you boost that audio in your program in Audition or whatever, and just always kind of use those settings over and over again, so that at least I guess at least on my end, if it's going to sound crazy, it sounds consistently crazy.
That sounds perfect, actually. I think it's a great tool to have to make sure that your final mixes sound quality like it. But let's say I want to go ahead and transcript my podcast. Well, how would I do that? Do I actually type out everything that I just spoke about?
I saw that question when you had sent your email inquiring about this interview, and I thought, wow, it's a really interesting question. I never had an answer to it until I made something meaningful enough where somebody wrote to me and said, hey, I like to do transcriptions. Do you mind if I do a transcription for this episode? Would you find it beneficial? And I said, yeah, I would find it beneficial, and a lot of other people would find it beneficial too. So due to the extent of my podcasting, I don't have a transcript for each and every episode. But I know at least I think the first 10 episodes of the Peace Revolution podcast have been transcribed, and we're in the process of updating tragedyandhope.com to incorporate all the podcasts and all the notes that we have at our availability to make them available to people in the future as well as the present.
I found I really wanted, once New World Next Week really started rolling a couple of years ago and the audience was really growing and it became really exciting, I was really into the idea of having transcripts. I thought, man, they're only, 10, 15-minute episodes. Surely we can get... I tried it here and there, tried to get someone who would do the work of trying to make transcripts. I think it probably ended up being just, people issues where people flake out. And I find that, there are folks who initially say, hey, man, can I really help? I want to do. And then once they kind of see how much work it is, they go, oh, God, I don't know if I can do that. So that's you finding, again, folks like Rich and folks like James Corbett. That's, I think, why I've always been so thankful to be able to stick with them. find people whose work you admire and keep kind of going with that. But what was my point?
Well, we were talking about transcriptions.
Transcriptions, I tried a piece of software. I think it was called like Audio Scribe, but it was so difficult. I found it really difficult. You had to sort of train it to recognize the voices so that it could accurately predict what those voices then would say. I just kind of reached a point where it's like, this is a huge pain in the butt, and I can't expend any more time on this. What I then discovered, and actually maybe even it really has kind of dawned on me more recently, again, now I'm working on Ground Zero. I think it's probably the same way that James Corbett kind of does some of his work, is it hit me like, oh, you write it ahead of time and then you sort of perform it or read it. And not to say that you have to sit there and read this thing that I wrote out. You're essentially writing an outline. You know, Clyde writes a big article every day, and that's sort of the blueprint for the episode. And you can kind of go over that. And yeah, you're reading it, but as you're reading it, if you wrote it, you know how you write, and you can kind of paraphrase, and you can make it sound more conversational and natural. So you may want to, again, it depends on what kind of episodes you're doing, what you may or may not be trying to kind of put out there and communicate, audio or video. You may find writing your sort of pre-script, to be a helpful thing. And then you've got that transcript.
That's a good point that I guess I didn't even think of until you said that. But I do. I did learn. In fact, even today I was thinking, I want to do a special report on this topic, and I've, got it written down on note cards and stuff like that. And then I thought, what I actually needed to do was write it up as an article, and where I would cut to a video, I'll just embed the video. And then basically I've got my special report in print and on video, and all I have to do is go downstairs and film it, edit it, publish it. And then you got these two. And if you had the audio from it, you'd have audio, video, and print. And the thing about transcriptions is people don't read anymore. Too few people read. They're about to have software that'll just transcribe everything people say, but people don't make the time to educate themselves on what has happened on this planet before they got here, because they think they know without having asked the questions, and that's not cool. That's probably why I started podcasting, right? So when you get back to transcriptions, you can write out your ideas ahead of time, either on note cards, in outline form, verbatim, and then you'll just get more used to it. Like the introduction I do for Peace Revolution, I write out. But the outline, everything I'm writing out came from my head, came from what I'm experiencing and feeling. I'm just going through the trouble to organize it so I don't leave anything out, so I don't put anything out of order, and so that I don't, say something that's not true or accurate or something. I want it's a personal preference, but I want anything I publish to age well with time and not be, spoiled like vinegar. I want it to, be like a fine wine. You can come back after 10 years and say, wow, that was actually I should, think a little bit more of myself when I was younger, and not be like, oh, I was young and didn't know anything. Obviously, I knew quite a bit, more than I give myself credit for sometimes, because that's how we all got here. So it's through the naivete to say, I could never do that, be on the other side of the microphone or, the speakers, or on the other side of the screen. We use these metaphors. But when you actually analyze what it takes to go on, what goes on the other side of the camera to make this happen, when you answer those questions for yourself, you're like, oh, wow, I could do that for myself. And that's a very empowering feeling that you're not really going to get in any school or corporation in this country. And so if you're, just going through school, getting out of school, unemployed, working a job, don't like it, any of these situations, curiosity, inventiveness, there's plenty of problems around to be solved. They need to be solved through communication. That's how we get our needs met. Podcasting, making videos, using the internet, leveraging the social networks for what they're worth. These are things an individual can do successfully. And, it's not just me and a couple guys named James. There's, millions of people out there creating media, creating internet movies, creating things that cross over and actually get people off the fence and say, I'm not ambivalent or apathetic anymore. I actually have enough informed, context for this situation to take action. And to take action with high degrees of certainty that what you're doing is meaningful and going to be shared and useful to other people.
Excellent. I think that I'll avoid transcripts altogether. So I guess that kind of leads into my next question. I guess you guys do a lot of things like day-to-day basis. Like I probably won't start doing the podcasting type stuff every day, but once it gets to that point, are there any tips or tricks you might have for efficiency to operate day to day?
I would say, and this is always kind of in the back of my mind, and I think it probably Richard and I maybe make a great point counterpoint, because again, we try and do similar things and maybe approach it in different ways. I come from a live background. For me, the only thing that's always kicked my butt and always made me produce work is putting myself in situations where curtain goes up at 8. You know, I did sound design for theater and even did a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. The show must go on. So having a deadline personally has always been really the way that I could work best. So then when I was doing, you know, the podcast, even from home, I would do it at a set time. Essentially setting up a situation to where you have to actually perform. Again, personally, I've found that's been the way that I've always liked to work. At the radio station back east, I worked at my college radio station for a long, long time. It was purely out of passion. The minute I got to college, and it was one of the main reasons that I liked the school, was that it's like, oh, they have a cool kind of indie rock radio station down in the basement of the English building. So from the minute I got to college in the fall of 1995, I got on the radio there. And some folks, you know, will say to me, I'm from West Virginia, born and raised, and that's actually where this school is as well, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Oh, you don't sound like you have an accent. And I wonder if getting on the radio immediately, you know, I wonder if unconsciously or subconsciously I tried to make sure I didn't, you know, sound like not that I ever really did sound like that, but I must have kind of trained myself to speak more clearly. So doing a weekly radio show essentially since 1995, in some way, shape, or form, I think for me has always kind of kept me creating work. Because I know that if I don't have that live deadline, it's easy for me to go, well, let me throw those clothes in the dryer and then I'll start. You know, I find it easy to always kind of put things off. Doing the live thing also, I'm throwing in some of the other points in my other little tricks of the trade. As far as audio quality and microphones, I've always loved, and this was once I discovered it at the radio station, again, back east at WSHC, it was out of, I think it was just out of sort of necessity, the radio, and kind of listened to how they sounded, and I wanted to sound better. And I always noticed that the microphone there in the studio, people would have already turned up to the level that they wanted it to, but it was an on and off switch that essentially if everything's wired at a radio station correctly, when you turn your microphone off and on, your monitor speakers turn off so that you don't get feedback. And I always noticed that when people would turn that microphone on, I was just like, I could just hear that room, and all I heard was just hiss, and it just sounded so awful to me. And I learned, it was like, wait, the thing to do is have it turned all the way down, turn the microphone on, turn the pot on, the potentiometer on, and then fade my microphone up as the music was ending. And then there was no ka-chunk kind of sound of, hey, now I'm on the microphone. The other thing that I started to do at WSHC, and I do it to this day, is I always want to have music just right below me. And I always want to be able to, at a moment's notice, to be able to have music below me so I don't feel like I have to fill every silence. So if I have a little bit of music playing behind me, I can kind of take a breath and take a moment and collect my thoughts and continue forward again, because I'd never really had a pre-written script or an outline. I knew the news stories, or I knew the songs, or I knew where I wanted to go, but I was always essentially improving it. So having a music bed for me always gave me that little safety net. I don't know if I need to repeat the end. I was essentially saying one of my tricks of the trade has always been to have a music bed, and I think it makes my podcast sound like Media Monarchy, and I think it's also something that can help cover up background noise or anything.
No, that's awesome. As a listener of Media Monarchy for the years during which you produced it, that was one of the things that always fascinated me. And when I started, doing, heavier editing to my podcast and not just recording it all in one, bit when you had layers, that's when I was like, okay, now I can put layers in here and I can put music under here. What type of music? Where am I going to get the music? How am I going to license the music? There's a whole bunch of other questions you have to answer when you do that. And sometimes it's just best to do what you do. The other things, James, he's from West Virginia, and there are people from that part of the country who do have an accent. I'm one of them. I grew up in Beaver, Pennsylvania, so it's not that far from where he grew up in West Virginia. And there's a certain, like in Pittsburgh, we call it Pittsburghese. And there's a whole different vernacular and a dictionary online that you can look and laugh and haha. But at the end of the day, if you want to clearly articulate yourself to other human beings in a business situation, in a social situation, if you want to project self-reliance and self-esteem, you're going to have to start with yourself, get some confidence through experience, through trial and error, through knowing that you're going to fall down, and here's how to get up and brush yourself off. And you're going to be wrong sometimes, and here's how to handle that. And once you take away your worst fears, let's transition that into what James was saying about doing something live. Everything that I do, because I have to do it for myself, and no journalist came and really, investigated what I had to, say back when I blew the whistle. That's why I started creating media, because there was no other way to get the message out unless I learned how to do it for myself. Thus, I've always, had a good situation where I don't have to necessarily do it live. I can take my time, plan it out, do it on my own time. It's, and I'm not that, I don't procrastinate that much, because once I formulate an idea, then I go with it and then I get it done, and then you get another idea, because that's how that all works. Doing something live, like hosting the Corbett Report radio show or hosting Jack Blood's show, or the things that I've done live in the past, it's always a little nerve-wracking experience, because there's this clock ticking and you got to be there. And is your mic going to work? Are you going to have Skype problems? Any of the things. Here's what I learned, because Lisa has recently done her own live interviews and gone through the same process. And here's what I said. You can have all these papers around. You can have all these notes. But really, all the work was done before you ever got on and the red light goes on, and all the work's done. When that happens, you can relax, because all your worst fears, all these things that you think might happen, that's not what's going to happen. Something you haven't even thought about is what's going to happen. And you have to have a method and use it consistently to deal with those situations, so you can do it gracefully, to speak with eloquence, and to, conduct yourself with elegance. These things come from the mind. They're not accidental. So, these are things that you have to consider. That being said, when you do a live show, there are commercial breaks, which is a nice little break every now and then. Gather your thoughts, get your notes back together. As a listener, I do not like them. That's why there's no advertisements in our podcast. And, that's why we roll how we roll. As someone who's doing an interview, I appreciate an advertisement every now and then, because it allows me to regroup and stay on point and communicate something meaningful over that other, otherwise time that they use advertising to get you just to be there so that you listen. So there's a way to work it for yourself. If you're someone who's on the listening end and you're listening to a show with advertisements, you should be, if you're listening to something meaningful, which is what you should be doing with your habitual time, you might be taking notes. You might be looking up things online while that commercial's on. You might be doing some other activity and it might be a quality product. You never know. But on most of the Clear Channel stations and whatnot, it's just, all about making money. So you have to be discerning. You have to be a discerning listener, and you have to be a discerning podcast producer in the first place if you want your audience to, be discerning likewise.
Great. Basically, now that the day-to-day operations, let's advance forward into the future. Now I want to start gaining some type of audience for my podcast. Do you have any tips on how to go ahead and get your voice heard out there?
James, you want to handle this one first?
I think when I initially started, I was just basically, for me, what happened was when I left West Virginia and moved to Oregon, I immediately went to the public radio station here and tried to kind of get a job. But I was like, oh, okay, this isn't going to work out. They're already filled with people and piled up with people who want to be on. And I needed to get an actual just job. So essentially I realized, I'm going to have to basically kind of do a podcast myself. So I hooked up with a an internet radio station here in Portland called the Portland Radio Authority, which was an internet stream, which again gave me the time schedule. That's why Media Monarchy was Friday mornings at 10 Pacific time, because that was the time slot that I began doing it. So that's what I stuck with. Sticking with it, I think, is the thing, and I think kind of referred to it earlier, that persistence, I think, and I always make musical analogies. Think about bands that you maybe didn't think that much of, but as the years go by and you still see them, it's like, damn, they're still, even if you still may not like or love the band, it translates into like, well, they've stuck with it. God love them. Like, they kept making music. Good for them. And years go by and you suddenly look at them as some kind of legend or some kind of statesman. So I think putting together a consistent piece of work is the huge thing to build the kind of audience that you would want. Because again, for me, ultimately, I would always try and talk about and cover things that I find interesting, whether that is music or whether that is, news and media and politics, technology, any of those things. It's primarily because it's been something I'm interested in, so I want to communicate that to probably other like-minded or like-interested people. So in the early days, yeah, of course, it probably felt like there was probably 12 or 24 people listening, and you can kind of get down on hitting that refresh button to see, how many downloads you've gotten. And I think it was just really through consistently making the work that I felt like I was proud to make each week with the show, making those connections with people, again, the like-minded people whose work I admired. So not only people like Rich and Corbett, but then, somebody like Doug Owen at Blacklisted News, he and I have been in contact now for, probably almost as long as, James and Rich, is making contact with those people that you like, and then maybe have them on your show. Maybe then they'll have you on their show, and then that's going to, that's going to cross-pollinate. That's going to spread. So I think for me, it was just kind of sticking with it and continuing and making the work, because I was ultimately making it for me and trying to make myself, kind of happy and feel like I was learning something and communicating and sharing that. Then the natural things kind of flowed afterwards. Hopefully.
I started out, let's see, Memorial Day 2006. I had made a 2 CD set. It was on CDs back then, because even MP3s were hard to kind of transfer. There's still not like a good audio. There's no audio equivalent of YouTube, and that's always been a business idea that I think is probably passed. So it's safe to just throw it out there, make it so I can use it. I'll promote it. But the point was, back then I had to formulate something on paper in a transcript, but I also put it on CDs because I knew people didn't read. So if you got a package from me, it had a transcript, it had 2 CDs, it had clear explanation. It's like, it's not about me, it's about this information. People are being taken advantage of. Check it out. You're somebody with a platform. So I kept thinking of them as an authority because they had a platform, they had an audience, they could distribute this information that I couldn't get out there, right? Because to me, if the courts aren't going to do what they're supposed to do with it and the press isn't going to give it to the people, then you have to find your alternative options. So I didn't get into this because I wanted to podcast or any of this sort of stuff. I created an audio message that ended up being broadcast to the world on Memorial Day 2006. And after that, there was a great demand for, hey, do you know anything else? Can you explain this? And I did have a lot more to express. So that's one of the first things that you have to have is a voice. You have to have a voice through yourself. You have to have something that you want to express. You have to have a need to communicate some valuable information to someone else who might be taken advantage of and lose their livelihood or their life savings or their life. So there are survival needs involved in what I did. And so in going forward, I got a website. I started I wrote an article. So the first thing I did before a podcast was I wrote an article called Paramount Propaganda, which was basically questioning why were all these copyright suits being filed against Loose Change filmmakers, Dylan Avery and company? Why were these clips not public consumption? They're private and they can be censored, and you can't have them in this documentary. And basically some stuff that I thought was a little strange. And from that, I then created the 9/11 Synchronicity podcast because I kept finding more and more valid points of data that were not being included in the so-called official story. And so I'd already read the 9/11 Commission report 2 years before. I'd already found out that same day that I read it, that there's never going to be a legitimate investigation, that was all consensus-based truth. It's not objective truth based on evidence. And so, from there, I tried to do public access. I went there. They took the training to learn how to use their video equipment. You try to borrow their equipment and bring it back, but that's kind of a kludgy process. So that's like James going to the Portland Radio Authority. His situation worked out. I got a bad taste in my mouth, always trying to schedule when I need to do stuff, and it's not going to be there. The equipment's not right. So I started picking up used equipment, and I kind of follow that route. So you can get used microphone, used mixer, whatever you need for podcasting. Even these days, the quality of footage coming out of smartphones is great. For what they are. You just need a good audio setup to capture sound, and that's what's going to make it a higher production value. So this idea of multiple people in the past, 7 to 10 years, picking up the tools around them, saying there's a problem, I think I can, help, just apply yourself to these situations. Go from the apathy that I can't do anything, that the world's a big place and this is just how it is, to, wait a minute, I see other people doing things that are, doing likewise. And James mentioned Doug Owen of Blacklisted Radio. He's also somebody that, you should check out. He's got a website. He's got a podcast. I know he's a viewer of the Ultimate History Lesson because we just sent him his order the other day. So he's somebody who sees something good and appreciates it. We put it out there free online, which is another strategy you can do with your podcast. You can sell it on CD. Here's the archives of my podcast, but I also put it out there for free. So people who want something for their home archives, they have an option. That's something you want to think about. If you produce something of substance, how do they preserve it off the internet? And, but for anyone who wants it on a torrent or Libsyn or iTunes or whatever, put it out there for free. It's all about the cross-pollination of information. You do that by finding a couple good people that are, working on the same value system. For the two Jameses and I, it was, hey, commercial-free, nutritious media that you can just turn on, listen to, and go about your day. Go exercise, go drive in a car, cross country, whatever you're doing. You don't have to reach for the mute button on your computer every couple minutes or be fiddling with the sound. You can just take it in at your own pace. Press pause, fast forward, rewind. We all press the fact that you need references and notes and links to make it useful, because that's how we would want it for ourselves. These are changes we got frustrated. We didn't see them, other people doing them necessarily. And so it's like, hey, we can be that change we want to see in the world. We can provide what we would want to listen to. And it's getting to be popular now. We've never done any professional advertising of any of the things we do. We've all let it grow naturally, organically, passed from friend to friend through links or social networks. And I know I'm saying a lot of words, but I know Pilato is also nodding his head because this just seemed like the logical thing to do, right, James?
Well, and I'm so glad that you mentioned about the notes, because I was going to plug that in. And even your reference to Project Constellation, that was something where you wrote your story and then read it. So when I heard that, I first listened to it, but then to be able to know that there was a transcript to go, wait, what is that place he mentioned? Okay, I've never heard of, whether at the time it was Booz Allen Hamilton, which again is in the news as we speak. It's having at least something I can go reference, and whether or not it's a full transcript, you might not have that ability. But even on something like New World Next Week, I obsessively want to document everything I mention. I want you to be able to go to the notes and go, wait, what was that thing? Even if it's just a tossed off reference, I want, again, it was something I want personally. I want to dig. So if that intrigues me, surely someone else out there is probably intrigued by it. So here's the way I found the information. Please go learn more than I did and share it back with me.
That's how we all grow in the right direction. That's what this is all about.
So yeah, I think that was a great note, that you may not be able to do a transcript, but to have always the sources and to always have the bibliography.
All right, awesome. So now that let's say I've even further down the road, I've gained somewhat of an audience. How do I track these type of things? Are there like blog, radio, like rankings, talk radio rankings? When I submit to iTunes, do I get a data stream back of how many people download this type of stuff? How do I track my growth is pretty much what I would be asking.
I laugh because I don't track my growth. I mean, I know that Peace Revolution's #1 rated in higher education on Podomatic because when I go to my dashboard, my management page, it says, you're at #1, places moved 0, and it says that consistently. So I was like, well, that's something I can mention during the podcast. But as far as downloads, you're going to get semi-accurate readings from your direct servers and stuff like that, but you're not getting, back in the old days, it was just everyone posting on other people's site, people downloading it, putting it on their own website. So something like Project Constellation, I didn't have that on the server that was hosted by Maria Heller Show, and then everyone copied it. And so it was on hundreds of thousands of servers in a couple weeks, and it's just all over the place. Something like that back then would go and live and persist in many different areas of the internet. Something like what goes on today, where everything's highly centralized, it's on a cloud, it might be hosted one place and show up 100 different places, all coming from that same source. So when you publish a podcast through, let's say, a server hosting company like Libsyn or Podomatic, they will list it on iTunes. It'll be, there'll be an iTunes link and people can click and subscribe, but it won't necessarily be in the iTunes store until you go to the iTunes store and go to podcasts, and over on the right, there's a little drop down menu and it says podcast, enter, submit your podcast. That's the step that you have to go through. So what I discovered the other day was, I had registered 9/11 Synchronicity on iTunes, and later when I started Peace Revolution, I renamed that stream the Peace Revolution archive stream. But I never submitted the new show, the new stream from Podomatic to iTunes. So I did that the other day, and I thought that was an amusing question when I saw that was one of your questions. I was like, well, I know how to answer that now. I had to Google it, and I had to look up a couple things the other day. I had to upgrade iTunes. But so to answer your question about stats, I don't use stats as a primary motivator of anything. Every now and then, if I haven't posted an episode for a couple weeks or a month, I'll be like, wow, it says over here that, the podcast is 1,200 overall and not in the top 100. So I'll be like, that just tells me I need to post another episode. I don't want the audience to feel like I'm not delivering on what I'm trying to deliver to them as far as a curriculum. But we're always posting other things as far as videos and other topics in the community, which is something, again, that we wouldn't have an online research and development community if I didn't have first have a podcast. And we created something back before that was a lesser form of the community today, but it was called the Think Tank. And it was for people from the podcast who wanted to go through the references and discuss the primary resources and kind of, nerdy stuff that you do when you're trying to learn and figure stuff out. And it was to provide a forum so we could provide those services. And those services are definitely necessary because we get more and more people, incrementally, naturally over time coming in and saying, wow, this is really great. I didn't know about any of this stuff. It was well hidden on the internet in plain sight, but people were always, anxious to spread it. And if they spread it, then your ratings will go up, then your downloads will go up, and your feeds through iTunes and whatever, service that you're using for that'll also go up. But it's a tertiary event that happens as a consequence of doing a whole bunch of other solid work up front. So it's not a metric of where you're going, it's a metric of where you've been.
I think a lot of it will be dictated just by whichever platform you end up kind of choosing. And I don't think we even actually mentioned, SoundCloud is becoming hugely popular. Rich, I would argue maybe that might be the YouTube for audio, maybe. But all those, whether it's Podomatic or SoundCloud or any of those things, they're going to have all their own analytics kind of built in to show you, who's getting it, where they're coming from, how often. Just like I know on my Google blog, so Media Monarchy, Pump Up the Volume, Cyberspace War, Food, all those things, I can look and see what the traffic is because, again, it's got the robust Google brain power kind of built into it. But like you said, Rich, that's also, not why we're into it, but you want to feel like, somebody's listening. So you'll have early days of, you'll want to kind of look and you go, oh, no one's really listening. But you keep doing your work and you'll find it will start to resonate. And if you're, true with yourself, being, putting that out there, I think, it will translate to people and it'll slowly start to grow. And before you know it, I went from, having a couple of dozen to then it was like, man, this is a couple hundred now. And it grew naturally, and you'll always find, I think, and I know I can relate this too with someone like Corbett, the things you expect to be big and to really, oh, this is going to be the thing. I've put, tons of work, blood, sweat, and tears. It's fantastic. And you put it out there and people go, eh. But then that thing that you kind of knocked off, that, you kind of busted out in an afternoon, you put up, that's the thing that, that resonates with people. James, laughs that his, 9/11, a conspiracy theory, a video he put up for, I forget, actually, I don't know if it was the 10th anniversary of 9/11. He put up kind of a tongue-in-cheek video that basically tells the fallacious official story of 9/11 with, funny kind of animation. It's his far and away most watched video. So you can never really know.
Millions of hits.
Millions of hits. It's you never know what's exactly going to take off. But that's what can be actually exciting, is that, again, on those moments where you are looking at your dashboard or looking at your stats, you'll see, oh, that's why so many people were on that episode. Somebody shared it on this other site, so finding that's something, kind of actionable information in the early times, and even, to myself now, finding people who do share your work, then going to those people and kind of either saying, hey, thank you, or then sharing their work, or again, building that community, I think is going to exponentially grow your audience.
Well, and this is where we can tie it back into social media and things that people do every day. Like that wasn't a sound effect I added to the video. I left TweetDeck open, and so people who are tweeting at me or pinging, and that's what was in the background while James was talking. It's not a rule, but how I started out was, when you do your podcast, when you have your statement that you're trying to get across, record it like nobody's listening. Record it like no one's going to hear it for 20 years, because people here are so dumbed down by the school system that even if they heard it, they wouldn't get it. It's all noise and they can't get the signal because there's too many words that they would have to learn to understand what it all means. So, as a function of that, it's like, when you record something, pretend, for the sake of, delivery in your recording, pretend nobody's listening to it right now. Pretend you don't have an audience, because at the beginning you won't have an audience. And if you're able to continue doing it, even though you're projecting that nobody's listening, you're going to get an audience, because you're not going to waste your own time and just, go into it without thinking. You're going to say, I have something to say. Here's what's meaningful to the future. If you're speaking to someone 20 years from now, like, what would you tell them about what's going on today? Would you tell them that, hey, all this whistleblower information is all great, but that's 10 years ago news, and it should have been stopped before they had 10 years of social network data for the artificial intelligence computers to chew on, because now basically you're not going to teach them anything new that they haven't already learned. Back then, they didn't really, they didn't have the whole system together. They just had the potential. Today, like, we've given them all the data that we want. Like, I remember in Project Constellation, because I re-listened to it this morning because I hadn't heard it for so long, and I was like, well, let me see how it holds up in the light of all this other people claiming big data and Google and NSA and all the other stuff that I mentioned, back in 2006. How's it hold up? Well, it holds up, and it holds up because at the time I recorded it like there was no one listening, because I'd already found out, like, the courts aren't going to do anything. The SEC is not going to do anything. The publications that I thought were investigative journalists weren't going to do anything. And what I was talking about was so far ahead of its time that most, alternative journalists couldn't wrap their head around it. So it was left up to me to kind of, take a couple steps forward and walk on my own, as it were. And I didn't get everything right, but the things that I did get right were valid, and they're going on today, and I'm not a prophet. I just read their business plan. I was able to see, what would they possibly want all this artificial intelligence? Like, what are they going to do with this stuff? Well, then when you see Google turn into Facebook and turn into all these other social networks, because they all came from intelligence funding, it's like they treaded the water. The whole community that you're podcasting to, all the technology that you're using to potentially podcast to an audience, came from the .com boom and all this artificial stimulus that they did and then crashed, took it away from most private companies and kept it with a few big companies so they could have an intellectual advantage and use it against the population. So it's like, just in the process of learning how to participate in the active literacies and communicate a message, I also learned about how they're using all this technology against us which, even if you don't have a live show, that will encourage you to keep moving forward and try to figure this out, because they have an agenda. They're organized. They got their talking points. They're communicating with billions of people like that. They're controlling people's attention and habitual time. You have a chance to interject yourself and what you find to be meaningful in other people's lives and help them make decisions, maybe for the first time in their lives, on their own. And so it's an important role. It's a responsibility. It's a duty. So if you want to have a message, I mean, even if it's entertainment, people need to chill out and relax too, because reality is pretty heavy. So whatever you're doing, I'm just saying, take it seriously, respect people's time, and don't leave your tweet deck on during an interview.
I think I would just throw in quickly, coming at it from my angle, coming at it from a, I went to school, I have a piece of paper that says I know how to do broadcasting, so I had to put those public speaking courses and all those sorts of things. I guess I come at it from an angle of again, thinking back, being on WSHC. I think I always looked at it, and this is what they'll tell you in public speaking, is, just, don't imagine, you're talking to however many people you might be talking to on the radio. Just imagine you're talking to kind of a small group of friends. So being at that radio station in essentially a small college town, it was easy for me to envision who was listening, because I knew that, Mary Beth and Lindsay, they always have it on down at the cafe, or I could actually visualize my audience with a pretty correct degree, knowing certainty of who was actually listening. So when you're maybe doing your podcast, try that, try to think, to speak to the future, maybe almost conceptually. It struck me conceptually, Richard, or to maybe think that you're just kind of having a conversation with a handful of friends that you're close enough with that you would kind of communicate the important information, that you hopefully have to share. Well,
because after all, who you're speaking to is people who took enough time out of their schedule, people who are investing, a couple hours of their time into listening to your thoughts. And so it's a one-way conversation a lot of times. And so you have to respect that they're on the listening end, that they can't interject or interrupt you. I love to interrupt people. So listening to a podcast is hard. I can't just yell at Jan or Henrik and be like, hey, wait a minute, you didn't mention this. I'm stuck here with, fast forward or pause. So it's an interesting experience that I think that is really, it's growing in popularity. I mean, it's a lot different than the old fashioned tune in at this time and listen to the commercials radio show that's been going on for 100 years. It gives people control. It's on their smart devices. It's in their cars. It's all over the place. And, because at the end of the day, you're an individual human being trying to figure out what's going on. There's a lot of other people out there like you. And those are the people who are, going to be tuning in, the people who have questions and don't assume they already have the answers just because they heard a bad story, and, they're fine with that, right? For some people, they're not fine and they want to look further. So, there are different genres of podcasts. What is the topic of your podcast that you're planning and kicking off with this inaugural episode, Jen?
Well, basically, I want to stray away kind of from basically covering the news, but more so covering how to digest the news itself. It'll probably lead in with an intro, a prologue type of deal with how to learn again. Basically kind of going through your trivium and that type of deal and good stuff like that. Trying to get people to get into the asking why. Not so what are we asking why about, but just asking why itself.
Well, and I'm sure that James will have something to say on this, but the way I would address that is you're trying to bridge a gap. You have come to an understanding through doing a certain amount of work and observation and organization of these ideas, and you're seeking to communicate that power that you've gotten from that knowledge to an audience. So you have to bridge the gap, go between what you understand and what they understand, and what's the difference. That's what needs to be communicated. So if you think in terms like that, I'm sure this is a technique that they've used on New World next week. But if you just think in terms of what's the difference, what's not being said that should be said, what evidence exists that should be considered in people's thinking that's not being presented. because when the corporate media gets going on a single point, they just all say the same thing all over the place for several days. Then they move on like that never happened. And now it's, oh, here's the tornado damage, or, here's this, right? And so it's always, as Neil Postman said, now this. Those two words compartmentalize, fragment your audience's memory. It cuts it off. It says, we can go from a really serious story about this girl on napalm and she's running down the street naked in Vietnam, and now here's Pillsbury Doughboy to sell you some muffins. And it works. And it works for a reason. And that's why I don't use any of that format in any of my productions, because I recognize that format as what it is. It's psychological warfare. And once you know that, you don't want to include it in your productions, because you're like, okay, now excluding the profit factor, how should human beings, kind of present this information? Well, I have an idea. Great. That's your opening summary, sentence, paragraph, whatever. Great. How did you get that idea? Well, I was looking at this and I saw this, and then I saw this, and those two things contradict. So then I went and asked this, or I looked this up, and you just follow your chain of thought. How did you come to the conclusion you're presenting? That's all the trivium is. It's saying, what did you observe? How did you identify it? What are the contradictions you removed? And what are you saying at the end that is only valid knowledge that an objectively, conscious person can validate? Because that's useful between human beings. That's a type of currency. That wisdom is a currency. They don't want us to have that. They want us to all parrot sound bites. They want us to have short attention spans. And in order to break that up, you have to understand what is broken about their format in communicating information between individuals who are just trying to survive, right? I don't have any bigger agenda than that. I figured out that this place is run by intraspecific kleptoparasites who plunder our production, and I seek to survive, right? We are all alive. That's what a live conscious person says. So the next logical step is, what do we do about it? And that's what you're asking. So I'm glad that you're asking these questions.
I think for me, it is interesting in that now, like I said, I do actually, I work on it. I'm the producer of a commercial radio show. So there are lots of commercial interruptions. It's been really interesting to kind of discover the people who call and contact the show are people who are generally older, who only listen to it through their old school terrestrial radio at the certain time. It's fun for me to know that there's a whole other segment of the audience who doesn't actually need our help in getting the show. They know how to get the podcast, and they know that the podcast is commercial free. So they're off and they're running, and they're hopefully taking that information and making it work. So for me on my own end, yeah, I've never really wanted to have any kind of commercial interruptions. I've always, I've been, something from probably the old school kind of DIY punk ethic, Jello Biafra, Dead Kennedy. It's like, I don't want to work with those corporate partners. So maybe when I was doing Media Monarchy, that's sometimes what the songs could kind of be. Because I would do a weekly 2-hour podcast. I would need, to rest. So that's having those songs, or even maybe an extended clip or into another song. Those would give me that kind of break. And, who wouldn't rather listen to a song for 5 minutes than commercials? So for me, that was always kind of an easy thing, I think, kind of format wise. And speaking of format wise, and a lot of this is Rich, as you were talking, reminding me of, study your Marshall McLuhan, your basic, understanding of media, that as you were kind of talking about commercial media, that manipulation, yeah, it's basically saying, play ball, be a good person, buy your Pillsbury Doughboy croissants, or you might be the one running down the road being napalmed. Like, if you don't play along, it's showing you kind of the punishment and reward system in a way. But what I was going to say really about McLuhan is, the medium is the message. Doing that work ahead of time, Rich, as you said, most of the work is already done. Once that light comes on, you've already done the hard work. Now it's just kind of, performing it, so to speak. But as far as New World Next Week went, the format was easy to sort of, and again, maybe I always kind of work conceptually. Once I know what the concept is, once I know, okay, this is what we want to do, for me, it's easy then to kind of get into a nice routine where then I can produce that work, because I've created, I know what genre, I know what kind of format I'm going to be working in. So for something like New World Next Week, when we started, it was obvious, like, well, to get it on YouTube, it has to be less than 10 minutes. What can we do in 10 minutes? We decided, well, let's just do 3 stories each week and, just make it that kind of simple. So we've stuck with that format from the very beginning. I mean, we've been doing the show now for 4 years nearly, and there's, we just published episode 156 and we still stick to the, 3 stories a week format, even though now there's not the time limit on YouTube. But I think I would make the analogy of, when compact discs came out, it was like, just because you can make an 80-minute album now doesn't necessarily mean you should or that people will listen to all of it. So the longer, all of us have looked at clips on YouTube and gone, 20 minutes, I'm not watching that. So a lot of times, at this point, the shorter the better. So still with the New World Next Week, we still try and stick to, the 15-minute format.
I think that's one of the keys is the happy medium. This idea that in order to upload something to YouTube, you had to conform back in the day to the 10-minute segment, which forced a lot of people to make short videos. But that's good because Americans have short attention spans. And when they first are getting introduced to this information, they need short bite-sized chunks. However, eventually, once your curiosity's back, turned on and you're investigating life, you want longer and longer pieces of information because you need that information. You got to catch up. This is the game of, they are ahead. You need to, progress rapidly. Can't afford to, take everything in little sound bites. You need something more substantial. So it's a happy medium, whether it's commercial free or commercials. The world needs both. We all listen to both. We have choice. That's great. Something that's long or something that's short in terms of length of podcast. People listen to both. I listen to both. Depends on how much time I have and what I'm looking to do. So I like to have both at my disposal. If I have several hours where I'm going to be editing and I don't need to listen to sound, I can put something else on, listen to it, and not have to reach over and change screens and do all this other stuff. However, if you have a couple minutes, you just want to, I got 5 minutes. I can watch this 3-minute video and close that tab. And that's one more thing I've checked out and, got some notes and we're all good. So, and the other idea was McLuhan. Medium is the message. He also did a book on the classical trivium, which is the mind control version of the trivium. We did a video distinguishing the trivium method to liberate your mind versus the classical trivium like McLuhan. He also came in with tune in, turn on, drop out, which I amended to thank you for tuning in and not dropping out because it's about catching on to the signal and hanging on to it. Keep learning once you find something that's valid, that has integrity. That's a great resource. Keep mining it for all you can.
I actually have one kind of final question, really. It's more so kind of what I've been thinking like the last couple of days and during this talk as well. I think we need to have a strong force on our end like they have, Bilderberg and Davos and G8, that type of stuff. We need to kind of, be that counter to that. We need to be able to meet together in person, face to face, and plan exactly how we're going to educate and inform by getting together physically at conferences and that type of deal. I think that it'd be a great time to do so and to get organized with all the alternative media sources out there that would be willing to participate in some type of discussion. There needs to be a counter strategy on what they're doing. We need to meet up physically and, maybe do the same thing that they're doing, plan things that they don't know about. So do you see the alternative media getting together in an open forum with the public in actual physical real time and being able to maybe perhaps take the show on the road and maybe speak at some type of different places in the country, maybe having an open forum specifically with everyone that we could possibly find together to be involved in it? Obviously logistics speaking, but do you see something like that happening anytime soon?
So this notion that even when we're talking via Skype, that we're not meeting in real person, we are all meeting in person, but we're just not in the same geographical location at the same time to verify physical presence. And there's a little doubt that goes with that, but that's life, right? To meet in physical, person at conferences and to go all over the United States, people are doing that all the time, away from keyboard. It's still real life, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that's real life. But away from keyboard is what you're talking about, where people would get together at, let's say, a 9/11 conference. as someone who has attended 9/11 conferences in the past, what I can observe is that very little gets done because nobody agrees on that which exists, and they all try to philosophize from midstream, and there's a lot of discordia, and some of that discordia that's going on is created by COINTELPRO and people who want to be trolls and just other people who are unhappy. There's a whole variety, and you know what's really hard to tell? You can't tell the people who are really like idiotic from the people who are professionally there to screw things up. So I always find it interesting. You can't tell if the person didn't do their homework or if they're there to muck things up or whatever. Either way, they're not a valid source of information. Move on. So these are the things that you encounter very rapidly in person, whereas on the internet, you would have the, you could just close that tab, and move on. In real life, these things happen, but they're all in one place. So that's a great experience, but I haven't seen a lot of progress come from that. Even the latest 9/11 consensus board, it's a consensus panel using the Delphi method of mind control as their truth. That's not truth. That anything that's agreed upon, that is not truth finding. That's bureaucracy. That's control. That's collectivism. That's a whole sort of mess. So there's a whole gamut of issues out there to be solved. And so if you want to find out, if you want to do live meet and greets in person and conferences and stuff like this, find out what other ones have been held in the past, what was successful and what didn't work about them. And then go, for all the different points you want to hit, do that same process, because then you're going to be able to actually possibly have something that is successful, because there have been a few successful group meetings out there. PorkFest is one for, anarcho-libertarian type people. So there are these groups out there, but, getting into something as nebulous as 9/11 truth, 9/11's an inside job, that leads with a conclusion, and people need to understand the steps that led to that conclusion, and that it's kind of a herd mentality where they think we have the answer. So we don't need to ask questions or look at evidence or review whistleblower testimony. I mean, I spend a lot of time watching C-SPAN, Benghazi whistleblower testimony, SEAL Team 6 family testimony. So there's a lot of information that I have to go through in order to be able to, observe it all, map it out, and then condense it down into something as listenable. And even then, when I condense it down, it can still be very long because I want to include all these primary resources from which I'm taking this information. And then I'm reflecting in my films and whatnot. So the podcast is more the granular version of it, because I don't know how long the internet's going to be there that we can search stuff and get these files. And if you have this on CD or it's on a smart device in a box someplace in a safe or wherever, someplace, that propagates into the future, then this data can be accessed and people can actually realize what happened during this point in history, because I don't think a lot of people see what's coming. What's coming is not very cool. And if you've read up on the Gulag and, Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and you see and listen or read or however you want to take in the information, what happened in Soviet Russia, that's child's play compared to what they want to do here, because they didn't have the technology to enforce all this. So this is why it's important to learn how to podcast, to teach other people how to do it, and do something while we still can, while it's, still somewhat legal.
I'd probably have to agree with you as far as meetings, large group gatherings and those kind of things go. To me, it makes me think of, we've all probably had to go to, employee meetings at your regular job, and you go there and it's always like, we never actually get anything done here. Everybody just talks about the couple of things that we already know need to be taken care of anyway. So for me, I know in all those kind of frustrated, work meetings that you kind of have to go to, when in reality, it's like, man, it's all won or lost out there in the field, out there on the store floor. We can have this meeting about what we blah, blah, blah need to do at the store, but it's not really going to matter if I don't carry that out all the time when I'm out on that sales floor at the grocery store or whatever it may be. I'm speaking from personal experience. So for me, that's my analogy, is the real action is going to happen on your own, and the choices that you kind of make in your real life. That's, James and I have been saying that a lot more and more on New World Next Week, that a lot of this kind of stuff, especially now when it comes down to food, and, the whistle is fully blown and no one has any excuse for, not realizing that the food situation has become kind of dire. But that's actually one that you can really start to kind of make make moves on your own, and you don't have to have a committee, you don't have to have a meeting. Yes, we did just have the big worldwide march against Monsanto, but that was a worldwide thing, and people did it in all their different cities. Maybe that's something you're kind of referring to. But again, yeah, for me personally, I've found smaller groups of kind of like-minded people that I know and that I trust, and that it blows my mind sometimes to think that I've been talking more to James Corbett than I do my own brother, which is sad, and I need to remedy that situation. But I trust James Corbett. I've now known him for years. So having that, a smaller group of people that you really kind of truly trust and can rely on, to me, I think is far more powerful and useful, I would say.
And I think you also have to, think locally, because the hope that you can travel 6 hours to go to some conference, or we drove 18 hours to get to Chicago, I think, for the 2006 conference. It's a lot of hype. And at the end of the day, there wasn't much information that I got at that conference that I couldn't have got from the internet. I did meet a few people. I mean, when I interviewed Jason Burmis the other day, we were talking about when we first met back in 2006. The Chicago conference was like a week after Project Constellation was published. So I knew who those guys were. They didn't know who I was yet. And we talked for a couple hours and had a great time. So there are a couple meaningful relationships that budded out of that interaction. But at the end of the day, I could have called them and said, hey, I'm an independent filmmaker. You guys are, if you're going to be home this weekend, I'm going to be in your, that part of New York. I'd like to come over and interview you guys. We could have had the same conversation, and I could have saved like 36 hours of driving in a rented vehicle that I couldn't afford. You know what I'm saying? So instead of putting yourself too far out there, it's like, well, that's a great idea. What realistically can I do with my resources and not have to put myself, maybe in harm's way? Because at that point, I didn't know what I was dealing with. But what I was dealing with was, they knew even if I was heard clearly, nobody would really understand what I was saying at that time, because the social networks hadn't been built. So people couldn't envision the future. But being a student of history, I already saw what they were trying to build with all this infrastructure and artificial intelligence and data mining, and, the blurring of the line by having the NSA outsource spying, collection, analysis, building of profiles to privatized companies like Booz Allen Hamilton, DynCorp, who was also doing sex trafficking and other things. They were in a lawsuit, SEC, with the company that I worked for, my employer. So these are all things that, I probably would have gotten a lot more hung up on, and not so easy to just be like, all right, well, that sucks that court doesn't work, and the investigative media in this country wasn't very investigative. I had an outlet. I had a healthy outlet online where I could share credible information and make great friends. James Pilato and I have never sat in the same room together. We've always talked over Skype, I think the whole time, Skype and the telephone. And so, we can have friendships these days. These are real friendships with real people who are not actors, by the way. I know that James, all of us have been accused at one time or another of being some famous actor who's a crisis actor or some shit. I'm not James Belushi's kid. I'm Richard Grove. I have a history. I'm a real person. And before you go accusing people of being someone else, you should check out the laws of physics and figure out we can't be in two different places at once, dude. So anyway, that's enough about that. You'll get crazy fans if you have a successful podcast. That's what I'm saying sometimes.
Well, and I think sometimes too that you'll, at least again, maybe it was lucky for me, or I find you'll get what you put out there. So I feel like 90% of the contact I've ever gotten through people that listen to Media Monarchy were really like-minded people in a lot of kind of similar situations. So again, if you're true with who you are, that's what you're going to receive, which that's what you want. I would say I did go to I went to Conspiracy Con, which again isn't necessarily the same thing, Jan, that you're trying to get at. I know you conference where you just kind of meet and greet and you hear people talk, not with there's an actual, agenda or action plan. But I had a blast going to that in 2010 because I got to meet and hang out with, Jordan Maxwell and Tex Mars and Michael Tessarian, folks who I had kind of, whose work I found interesting throughout the years. And, people like Jordan Maxwell, it's like, he's not going to be around forever. Actually, I got to hang out with the dude. Like, I got to take a picture with him. And so that kind of stuff, was fun. And it really, kind of fueled media monarchy. But again, at the end of the day, that's, for me, it wasn't really, where I was at.
And as a last comment on that question, and to wrap it up here, I don't want to impede your optimism or anyone else's optimism. I would say, like 0.1% of the correspondence I've ever received was negative. And when you get correspondence, you just weigh it. Is it true or not? If it's not true, you discard it as arbitrary and move on with your day, no matter what name they're calling you or whatever. Right. And if it is true and you have something to improve or, get done, then do it. And either way, you're going to meet, like I said, 99 out of 100 people are going to be great individuals who are very much it's not so much of a similar mindset. We all have these things in common that we're trying to preserve in our lives, what we call the American way, freedom, thinking for ourselves, self-responsibility, self-esteem, and self-reliance that's not, dependent on conspicuous consumption. These are some of the things that make America unique at some point in history that we're trying to resuscitate right now. And I just want to say that, be optimistic. Your audience is optimistic. They're hoping for the best. There's a lot of people out there that feel like there's no one else that knows the things that they've been reading. And it's part of our job to let them know. We are here. We are checking this stuff out too. We are human beings just like you, trying to figure this out. I don't know any of the total answers, but having done some homework, I can definitely tell you we're not being told the truth by the corporate media and our politicians and all this sort of stuff. So we need to stop what we're doing and pay attention. And if there is some sort of way that the public could ever figure out 9/11 and bring these people to justice, answering your last question, I think it's through an incremental drip, drip, drip of media from as many faucets as we can, because if you were to, if the audience gets the intellectual self-defense skills that I'm laying down in the Peace Revolution, and they get their media monarchy and their Corbett Report and all the other independent podcasts out there, if they're getting all these symbiotic pieces of data, all these different puzzle pieces that we're offering on the table and say, hey, these are credible pieces. Can you put together the puzzle in a meaningful way such that you can find serenity? There's millions, there's actually billions of people out there that would be interested, but we could actually reach millions realistically, because some of those other people on the other side of the fence, and they've already set their trip, their GPS to a different destination, right? They don't want to do any work. If you're a self-responsible adult, this is work. It's it's the work of living. It's the joy of living, and you can make it part of your lifestyle. You can make a livelihood if you give it the same care and respect that you would give to any other individual human being.
Yeah, I think for me, it was always a natural. I think once it all kind of came together and podcasting became a thing and blogging and all that stuff, for me, and again, I can only speak from my own personal experience, but for me, it was like, this is what I've been looking for. I mean, media monarchy really is me. I couldn't do it any other way. So hopefully that's why it resonates, is because I think always through my life in some way, shape, or form have been media monarchy. It just maybe didn't have a title and it didn't have a format, but I've always just been personally interested and passionately excited about new information, new art, new music, and that's always what I've wanted to try and share with people. So it was only with podcasting, it was like, aha, this is how I can do it.
Well, and not only that, but what we're talking about can be applied to many different fields. Not everyone's going to be a podcaster or a filmmaker. Some people might want to provide some sort of different service or product to help aid people in getting to where they want to go along the way. That's what we're all trying to do. We're all different, parts of the path, but we can help each other by leaving credible, legitimate signs along the way in the form of media. And, every piece of media was created on a piece of media before it. And that's a pretty trippy thought. So, that means it's time to wrap it up for this episode. Jan, do you have any?
Hey, thanks for.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for chatting with me. Actually, it's been a pleasure speaking with you guys. Like I said, I've been listening to you guys for years, so it's been a pleasure. It's like really awesome to see that you guys are doing what you guys are doing, and things keep growing, things keep getting better, production value, everything like that. It's a joy to speak with you guys, and we'll probably have many more conversations in the future.
I look forward to it. Go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I hope so. I hope so. That's what's always so much fun about doing these things is it fills you with there are other people doing this. And again, it's not too hard. I mean, we exchanged what over the course of a few weeks, we exchanged maybe a dozen emails and we were able to put it all together. And that's what brought us together now. And then we can build upon this. So thank you.
And the questions that led to this show were we interested? And if so, what date and time? And then once you nail out those questions and answers via email or Twitter or text or whatever, then you're going to have more work to do because you'll be producing an episode on your own. Thank you for tuning in and not dropping out. All right, guys, we're off.
Bam.
Cool. Thanks for doing this. It's been a really great pleasure, honestly. I guess keep fighting the good fight. I mean, you can't do much more than that.
Well, we can. It's about. It's not so much fighting the fight. It's like falling down and being willing to fall down again. And after you do that a bunch of times, then you discover you really don't need to fight because you've made yourself stronger than the opponent. Like the opponent is not intellectually able to defend themselves. They've been doing a bunch of crazy shit. They've been getting called on it. There's a lot of evidence now. And that's one of the problems over the past 10 years is the way that the evidence could have been gotten. Well, there was a backdoor in that software. So none of those companies, you can't go after the TARP companies or all those bailout companies because those data, that data, they kept everything except that data. Right? Mm-hmm. But now with these other dudes coming out saying, hey, it's not cool. Apparently it's in vogue now and, people are listening. So I think that whistleblower that blew, the guy who blew the whistle and came out in the video today, his worst fear is that everybody's going to hear what's going on and nothing's going to change. And that's kind of, scarier than some dude whacking you, right? It's like, oh, you just gave up your livelihood and no one's even going to do anything about it. It's just going to go on. They're all, okay, whatever. What's on TV tonight, right? But at the end of the day, I think incrementally people will wean themselves off of Facebook. They'll get smarter about how to protect their data, and these things will become valuable again soon. But in the past 10 years, they haven't been very valuable. Everyone's like, oh, here's my data. Give me the service, right? That's not cool because the people that we gave that power to can't be trusted. That's the truth.